We are very used to thinking of Ruth, the story of Ruth, as a story of chesed, and it is. There's a lot of chesed in there. What do you think are the themes of Ruth besides chesed? Anybody, what do you think are the themes? What is the story about? Anybody have an idea? Or you can disagree. Maybe it's not about chesed. Any thoughts? Yes, Brenda.
It's about giving, and that's what they did. She gave up herself to everyone. And to her family.
Beautiful. It's about giving. In fact, we might tie it to Mayan's beautiful teaching and say it's almost in some ways about sacrifice. She sacrifices of herself for Naomi and the Israelite community that she doesn't know, has never met, and is going to move to be part of. I love that. That's a great idea. Giving and sacrifice. Anybody else have an idea of what is a theme, if not the theme, of the book of Ruth? Yes, Troy. Joining yourself to the Jewish people. Beautiful. Traditionally, Ruth is seen as a convert, though there was no such thing in those days. But spiritually, the rabbis looked at the book and wanted to see her as converting. There was no conversion process in those days. Basically, if you married a man, you were the member of the man's religion, and if you were a member of if you married a woman, you were, if a Jewish woman married a Moabite man, she became Moabite. Why? Because most likely she'd go live in Moab, and there were very few shuls in Moab. And in Eretz Israel, if a Moabite woman married an Israelite man, normally they would move to Eretz Israel because that's mostly where he'd live and where his work was taken. And there weren't too many Moabite temples to Dagon in the middle of Bethlehem, for example, right? So it was really a default thing. There was no spiritual process that developed in later Judaism. But I'm glad you brought it up because that's how we tend to think of the book of Ruth, as promoting via rabbinic interpretation. Lovely. Anyone else have a thought about a theme? Well, we have two good themes. One is about giving and sacrifice, one about conversion. The Rabbi Zeira in the Midrash suggested that it teaches chesed and gemilut chasadim, the doing of deeds of loving kindness. But such things sometimes tame and gloss over the chutzpah of the book of Ruth, right? Because there are other messages and other ideas in the book that sometimes aren't brought out when we only hold up conversion, giving, and chesed. Those are three important things. They deserve to be held up and honored and celebrated. But the book has other things, as I want to point out today, that there's a chutzpah in the character of Ruth, and there's a chutzpah to the book as a whole. So the most obvious one comes when we look at the passage from Deuteronomy on page, and if you're on page 9, the very first source there. That passage says, no Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to Adonai's community. Not even the 10th generation from now shall be admitted to Adonai's community. Never, because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey after you left Egypt. You shall never concern yourself with their welfare or benefit as long as you live. So much for chesed and well-being. But how does that passage in Deuteronomy contradict the book of Ruth? What do we know about Ruth? Where is she from? She's a Moabite, and yet very clearly in the Torah, Deuteronomy is part of the 5 books of the Torah. It says you can't admit any Moabite into the community. Ruth is a Moabite. How is it that she gets to marry an Israelite? And then, okay, they lived in Moab, but right, and that's where they got married. So there weren't too many Jewish women there, so he married a Moabite. But how does she get to go with Naomi and be so welcomed? Interesting, right? That doesn't seem very likely. How do we manage it? So one of the ways that we can manage this is by looking at the Talmud solution in Yevamot. And if you look there, they have this idea that that there's a debate concerning the subject of how it is possible that Ruth could have been admitted. And they have a debate in there in the time of King Saul centered on David's credentials. Because David was, as we read at the end of the book, was a descendant of Ruth. So if Ruth is illegal, then maybe David's illegal, right? Everyone becomes illegal, theoretically, if you go by this passage in Deuteronomy. So according to this debate that's had, the story ends with a defender of David and his right to everything that he got. And according to Rava, the defender in the argument says in Yavot, girded his sword like an Ishmaelite, exclaiming, whosoever will not obey this halacha will be stabbed with the sword. I have this tradition from the Beit Din of Samuel the Ramathite, an Ammonite, but not an Ammonitis, a Moabite, but not a Moabitis. So how does this passage try to harmonize the clear contradiction between Deuteronomy and Ruth? How does the Talmud try to say Ruth really is okay? She's a woman, right? So when it says in Deuteronomy that lo yavo moavi bakahal, the Talmud says moavi velo moavit. It means specifically a Moabite, but not really a female Moabite, a male but not a female. That's how the Talmud interprets. It didn't seem that way when we first read it, when we said no Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted. No, I bet very few of you thought, oh, they're talking about those men Moabites. The women Moabite, they have a lot to them. They're good. We should let them in, but not those men. That's probably not what we thought. We usually thought we read no Moabite means no Moabite. Male, female, whatever gender, no Moabite. But that is not how the Talmud chooses to read it, right? Yes, Evan.
But didn't you mention something about like marriage in general, about how they didn't have a lot, about how there is a lack of option as well. But is there a possibility that because she married a Jewish man, that she would have been exposed to at least a little?
She would have been what?
That she could have been exposed to at least a little bit of the religion, so it wouldn't have been completely 100%.
Well, interestingly, actually, Naomi and Elimelech left because of a famine to Moab. And it's there that the two children, Machlon and Chilion, who knows what their real names were? It's hard to believe that their names were like, virus and destruction or whatever, right? Machlon is a plague, like a horrible illness, right? So I name you COVID. Who's going to name their child COVID, right? Who's going to name their child destruction? So whatever their names are, real names are, they're called Machlon and Chilion. One of those two married Ruth, the other married Orpah. We're not really sure who married whom, but they lived in Moab. How would they have learned a lot about Israelite religion, which centered around community and a temple, when there was none right? So the chances are they basically behaved, they presented themselves very Moabitically, whatever the adjective is.
I didn't say like all of it. I'm just saying like a little bit, because even like because typically speaking within families, even if you don't have access to a lot of your like spirituality, a lot of like families at least with a parent, they do their best to pass down even the tiniest little bit that they're able to. Like for example, if you're to apply that idea to something of a little bit more familiar, like modern day, a lot of immigrants that come to America, despite the fact that there's a lot of their culture that they may not have the ability to practice. They pass down whatever, like they pass down whatever they can. It's extreme.
Yeah, so you would fit in very, very well with the Beit Midrash of the Talmudic rabbis in defending a textual contradiction. Some people just do not like contradictions, and they do not like when things aren't orderly and 100% according as planned. And when life changes, they figure out a way to say life hasn't changed at all, and figure out a way to harmonize it. And you did that beautifully, and that is very rabbinic of you. It is doubtful that the text in Deuteronomy actually meant anything but no Moabite whatsoever. It seemed to be very clear, and you wouldn't have known that it meant anything different unless you had the Talmud in later years, right? Because there is nothing that suggests that. We're going to go on because of time, because you'll see that the rabbis weren't even content to leave it in the Beit Midrash. They wanted to strengthen their own Midrash, their own interpretation, by putting it into the words of actually Boaz himself. So if you look at the text on the same page that says Besikta de Rav Kahana, commenting on Boaz's acknowledgement of Ruth, that you came to a people you had not known yesterday or the day before, this Besikta de Rav Kahana puts into Boaz's mouth, if you, Ruth, had come to us yesterday or the day before, we would not have accepted to you, since the halacha of an Ammonite but not an Ammonitess, a Moabite but not a Moabitess, had not yet been made. So according to this midrash, the actual law that the Talmud makes up that says it refers to men only, not women, was actually made on the very day that Boaz married Ruth, which is really, really interesting thing to posit. Number one, it admits that it's making up a new halakha and that it is not part of Deuteronomy or the Torah. It actually says it because it says it's a new halakha made up by Boaz, who did not live in the time of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy was well before the time of Ruth, hundreds of years. So number one, the rabbis are admitting that whether you think of it as being in the time of the Talmud or in the time of Boaz, it clearly is not part of the Torah, and the new law is modifying or even against the words of the actual Torah. Number two, it's very, very interesting because it shows that they weren't on such good footing if they had to try to put it in somebody's mouth, right, who is not among them. And nobody seemed to abide by that halakha except Boaz, and then not for years until the rabbis made up the halakha actually in temple times. Really, really interesting. Trying to ameliorate the problem of the acceptance of Ruth, which everybody seems to do. And many other ways, the rabbis were great in trying to wish away the discrimination against Moabites and Ammonites. And what we can say to those efforts is kol hakavod, right on. We don't like discrimination against anyone, even Moabites or Ammonites, even left-handed people, even blue-eyed people, whatever it is, discrimination is not good. Israeli, Palestinian, whoever it is in the world, no one should be discriminated against blanketly like the law in Deuteronomy tries to promote. However, the fact remains that the peshat of the verse is the peshat of the verse. It is very, very clear that she still is ineligible because of her Moabite origins. In any event, we are going to go forward, and some suggest that there's something about the law of the Levir. Levir is from a Latin word meaning brother-in-law. And so we're going to look at the law of the Levir in Deuteronomy, not long after the passage about Ammonite and Moabite. So it says there, the actual law, and then I'm going to ask you on the other side, how is this similar or dissimilar from Ruth, the case in Ruth? So when brothers dwell together and one of them dies with no offspring, the deceased's wife shall not attach to another party outside the family. Her husband's brother shall be intimate with her. He shall marry her and perform the levir's duty. The first child that she bears shall be accounted to the dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out in Israel. If that man does not want to marry his brother's widow, she shall appear before the elders in the gate and declared, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name in Israel for his brother. He will not perform the duty of a levir. The elders of the town shall then summon him and talk to him. And if he insists, saying, I don't want to take her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in front of the elders, pull the sandal off his foot, spit in his face, and declare, thus shall be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. He shall be called throughout Israel the family of the unsandaled one. So does this seem to relate to anything in the book of Ruth? And you can look at that, how does Boaz marry Ruth? Does anybody remember? Yes, though it doesn't quite say that, but yes, for sure. It seems, or likely did beforehand. And according to the Mishnah in Ketubot, one of the ways to acquire a woman in marriage is through cohabitation. So that certainly would make sense. But if you remember, Boaz says, I can't redeem you because there's a kinsman who's closer. There's a distant cousin, and they went in front of the elders, and he said to the cousin, if you want to redeem, you get all the land and property of Naomi's husband, Olav Shalom. I don't know if he said Olav Shalom, but he said of the property. And he said, yes, I want the property. And then in response, Boaz says, but that includes taking care of Naomi and Ruth and any children Ruth might have in perpetuity. Maybe I don't want that property as much if I'm acquiring all this economic burden of not just one person and maybe not just two people, but anyone that Ruth marries and has children of, I have to take care of them. So he refuses to marry Ruth. He takes off his sandal and throws it in a sign that he's relinquishing his duty, at which point Boaz says, okay, I'll be the redeemer. I'll take care of Ruth and Naomi. And on top of that, I'll marry Ruth. Not just take care of her, but I want her as my wife. So knowing that, what's similar to the case in Deuteronomy of the brother-in-law and what's dissimilar? Not an easy question. So in the biblical law, if a man dies without giving children, his brother must marry the widow. That's not the case here. Which, whoever Ruth's husband was, there was only one brother and he died. So there is no one who comes under the law of levir. This is a distant cousin, has nothing to do with the law of levir. It is also the case that the first child is supposed to belong to the husband, but it doesn't say in when we read the passage from Ruth, it didn't say that the child belongs to Boaz. It actually said that the child belongs to Naomi. But if it's the law of levir, it should say a child is born to Machlon, or a child is born to Chilion, whoever the husband was. It doesn't say that. So it clearly also doesn't seem to fall under the rule of the levir. So it seems like this possibility of the levir that some of the scholars point to is wrong, even if the language seems similar. He throws off the sandal, but in the law of the levir, it's the the impending marriage, or the woman he's supposed to marry, who takes it off and spits in his face. Ruth doesn't take off a sandal. She doesn't spit in the guy's face. So there's nothing really here that's the law of levir. The only reason why it's here is Boaz is trying to justify a clear break with tradition. of marrying someone he's not supposed to marry, who's a Moabite. And as in line with every good rabbi who's justified making a new law in the history of the country and the history of our people, rather than saying, I'm making up something new, I'm creating a new halakha, I'm starting something new, he realizes the prejudice against Moabites. And what does he do? He changes the halakha. Not only does he change it, he decides he's going to marry this woman and publicly do so. So it's really, really great how both the Pesikta Rav Kahana and the book of Ruth itself talk about how change in halakha happens, particularly when kindness is involved, particularly when the halakha becomes damaging to a people or to a person because of who they are and nothing more about what they actually do, that the halakha should be changed. It can be changed even by a non-rabbi like Boaz, if only the people agree. If you get the people to agree, you can change halakha. What's interesting, in fact, is that the people seem to agree immediately. The people offer a blessing on the marriage. All the people seem very, very glad. Oh, Brenda, you have a comment? Oh, I thought maybe your hand was up. Yeah, so the people seem very, very glad and consent and seem very, very happy about this. Do the people at the gate not know Deuteronomy 23, which says a Moabite can't enter? Don't they know the history of mistrust and the history of war between Moabites and Israelites? Sure they do. But we're not talking about all Moabites. We're talking about Ruth. Ruth, who showed the kindness that we hope that we show, who lived by the values of the tradition that we espouse, even though she didn't even read the Torah. Yes.
Something you said sparked a question.
Go for it.
So, in our tradition, we always talk about God being king and mighty and powerful and reigns over us and all this stuff. And we usually don't think that our kind of American idea of, or Enlightenment idea of the extent of the government has any place in our tradition of God and all that. But is it at all possible to argue that God is only our king and God's law for us is only valid because we accept it? And if we ever cease to accept it and overthrow it or something, that it would not be valid anymore, and God would not be our sovereign anymore?
Beautiful. I love that. So for those of you at home who may not be able to hear, Troy suggested that maybe part of the reason that God can be considered a sovereign in some way is because we consented to at Mount Sinai and in various places along the way with Joshua and entering the land, with Esther and Mordecai and the community there, we reaffirmed a relationship of covenant between God and the people. But if we can always get out of the covenant by saying we don't want a part of the covenant, and God can always say, I want to get out of the covenant with you. Or we can say we want to rearrange the terms. What's great about the covenant is that as we've studied here before, there's a famous passage in the Talmud where the people make a law, and when Rabbi Eliezer says, you got to do it my way because I have the right way, I'm an expert in this line of work, and to show you I'm right, I'm going to ask a bat call, God's voice, to come down and say so. God's voice comes down, and the people in the Midrash say to God, Lo b'shamayim hi. They quote the Torah and say, halakha is not in heaven. Law has nothing to do with heaven. You stay out of arguments. When scholars in an academy, people in a synagogue are arguing for the sake of heaven, you cannot be involved. This is our side of the covenant for us to work out. So halakha was by the rabbis and even as seen as the interpretations of the Torah going back. It even says you should listen to the leaders of your generation, the committees of your generation in Deuteronomy as well. So what you're saying is absolutely correct, that halakha, while deriving from God in some theological sense, in practical terms, it has always been a project of the Jewish people to decide how is it that we live in a godly way, that God would smile upon us. The end of the story with Rabbi Eliezer is God smiles and says, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. Not in a negative sense, but yeah. At 43 years old, they finally moved out of the house. and they're finally making some decisions without hawking me every 10 minutes and asking me for money every 20 minutes. Finally, my children are taking responsibility for their own lives. That's how God is depicted in the Talmud, and making our own decisions, whether it's Boaz or the rabbis of the Talmud or us today. It's very, very powerful. One final thought, we're going to move on. The people are so happy that in verse 12, they bless. May your house be like the house of Peretz, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which Adonai will give you by this young woman. Not only that, the genealogy of King David begins not with Boaz in the text, isn't 7 generations back, but 9 generations, and starts back with Peretz. Why start with Peretz? Who is this Peretz character? Well, if you remember Peretz was the child, one of the children of the offspring of Judah and Tamar. Judah was the oldest son of Jacob, and he inadvertently slept with his daughter-in-law, and one of the children of that union was Peretz. It's an unseemly union, just like Boaz and Moab, Boaz and Ruth are in some way not condoned by official legalese, and yet something good came out of Tamar and Tamar and Peretz, Tamar and Judah's offspring, Peretz. And the word Peretz means making a breach. And it seems that what they're getting at is sometimes it's important for us to make a breach in the tradition to rescue the tradition, metaphorically. Sometimes it's good to not leave teachings turned into stone, but to make life-enhancing actions. That goes along with what HaYam taught, that sometimes texts and like prayers get reified and they end up meaning something. We mouth our words, but they sort of don't course through us. We have to use melody, or we have to use what you said, take a moment to center yourself before prayer begins, or you have to do what Phil said and make sure that immediately after services, you start living by the words that you prayed. You got to do something to make those words come alive. And for law, what has to happen is you have to continually renew the law. Sometimes you have to reinterpret it. Sometimes you have to modify it. And sometimes you have to make a hole in the wall. You have to breach the wall in order to rescue the tremendous tradition. So the reasons usually given for reading Ruth on Shavuot are many, of course. But there's a lot of ambiguity in the book of Ruth. And there's a lot of overlooked features, and I tried to point out how chutzpah the features are. Ruth goes to a field where a lot of other men are. She finds where Boaz is and says, I'm going to lie down next to this dude. Please put your blanket over us, sweetie. And he does. Now, you might think that the word blanket means something other than what it means. And when it says she reveals his margoliotav, you can claim that it means regal legs, but the word actually means jewels. She uncovered his jewels. I'm not sure if under the blanket he had some sort of piercings that were ruby and diamonds on his navel that she was uncovering. I doubt very much that that's the case. I suppose you can interpret that as a possibility. It may refer to some other jewels, the text. That's sort of a chutzpah of the book and a chutzpah of Ruth to go to a field and do that. It's a chutzpah for Boaz to respond by taking on the cause of uprooting a law and allowing her admittance into a community which on the book says Moabites can't come to Shul, and changed forever the law of our people to one that renders this story that we always have said is a book of kindness, even more of a kindness and even more of a book about Gemilut Chasadim than we ever imagined. I hope that this holy chutzpah session that we've just had, that we should use chutzpah sometimes for good and challenge laws in the book that are discriminatory, whether they are old-time laws or laws that people are asking for now. There's a rash of over 600 laws going through the states now that are severely trying to restrict the rights and even the humanity of LGBTQ plus people. There are laws on the books in some states now that are trying to demean the history of African Americans and people of color in this country and their contributions. So when we read the book of Ruth, a Moabite who is poor and a woman who ends up actually enriching the Jewish people for good and changing our culture to one that is even more a culture of kindness, a culture of chesed, we should be very, very proud and hope that this will be our legacy too. Chag Sameach, everyone. Baruch Tiyah, Baruchim to you. We're going to continue now by singing a song for the study that we've done. Traditionally, after study, we do Kaddish de Rabbanan.